Hello there, everybody, and welcome to the Great West. This is one of those pieces of American history that often gets misunderstood, and we're going to try to add a little bit of perspective here between this particular lecture and the visuals PowerPoint that you'll also find in the materials. So let's go ahead and get started. And so when we talk about Indians in the West, and I'm using that term rather than Native American or Amerindian because that would have been the term they used at that particular time. And when we start looking at that Indian population, you look around 1860, that is right on the eve of the American Civil War. And part of Native Americans being moved, being shifted onto reservations, and basically their civilization um, vanishing from a large part of American history starts at that time. And to our best guess, there's roughly 360,000 Native Americans living west of the Mississippi. There are smaller pockets east, but the vast majority live west of the Mississippi, and we think there's somewhere in that 360,000 range. It is definitely under 400,000. So that is not a huge population at all. And considering the vastness of that territory, it's going to be very sparsely populated by Native Americans. All right. So what happens between 1860 and roughly 1890, which is a very specific year 1890 is, because of a particular event that happens with the American census. What happens between 60 and 90 is you have white settlers pressing in from both directions. You have them not only coming from east to west, but you're going to have some starting coming from west to east with California and Oregon Territory, Washington area. As those populations increase, people begin to fill in that middle part of the nation. Now, one of the things that one historian's taught an inevitable clash. And when we go back to the American Civil War, you heard about as an inevitable conflict. Well, this is its own little version right here. This inevitable clash between an acquisitive civilization means we want to acquire things and a traditional culture, which is going to be that Native American civilization. That inevitable clash looms. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose, especially when you have an American culture or an American civilization that is very acquisitive and wants to, spread from ocean to ocean, which we already did. But now the last land that was unclaimed, that seemed to be relatively wild and uncivilized, was right there in that middle of the country. All right, so who are these Plains Indians? What do they do? There are numerous tribes. Oh my goodness, I cannot recount them all for you. Okay, but they're buffalo hunting Indians on the plains. That buffalo is the great engine of their civilization, from clothing to food to tools. The bison or the buffalo population is so key to their survival. And then, with the Native Americans, the introduction of the horse by the Spaniards, it is not something that is here when the Europeans arrive, but that introduction transforms their culture and it allows them to move farther and wider. Okay, so the hunting and gathering can take place over far greater distances, and it allows for more intertribal warfare, which was never really at the level that you see in European civilizations, but it did happen, and the horse allows it to take place faster and over wider areas. Now, I put on here that they're skilled riders and fighters. Well, it does not take Native Americans long to master these techniques, which shows you, in some ways, how their culture is misunderstood by the European or the white population. Now, how about the relations with the Native Americans? Now, what you get is, notice I put here, environmental factors start to undermine it. Absolutely, because in their civilization, they are so reliant on the environment around them. And that should not shock us, but in a lot of ways, it tends to. Okay, because the first thing, and this we've seen this since the first Europeans come to the quote New World, back in the in the middle and late 1500s, is that white settlers spread cholera, typhoid, and smallpox. These are diseases that Native Americans had no natural resistance to because for hundreds and thousands of years they had not been exposed to these, much like Europeans had and built up their natural immunity. Native Americans did not have it. And then, the buffalo, and it's one of those we start reducing those herds through hunting. That became a big thing, and also simply killing them off because they were a threat to the railroads. They were a threat to livestock. You could not enclose these great fields for your livestock, so you start to kill them off. And where there have been millions upon millions of these animals, those are slowly reducing into the thousands by the late 19th century. Okay, so what happens is if there's a diminishing supply of something, people are going to compete for it, and the tribes do start to compete for that ever diminishing supply. So they're starting to fight with each other. Then you got the white populations moving in, from both areas. You've got a real problem if you're a Native American at this point in time. Then you've got some of the worst to deal with. You've got the American government, and the American government is really good about signing treaties and developing treaties. They're not really good about keeping them. And so you see this as far back as the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851 or Fort Atkinson in 1853. Not that you're ever going to need to know what those treaties entail, but we need to know that the American government on one hand is offering the Native Americans one thing, and on the other is going to simply be like Lucy with that football and Charlie Brown and take it away. All right. But as we start to see, the federal government will say, oh, this land over here is yours, Indian tribe, and we're never going to touch it. Oh, until we find something over there that we like, or something new comes along. So this reservation system, we, as the American government, are trying to hem Native Americans into a narrower and narrower field, which is not their traditional way of living and their way of surviving and the way their civilization is structured. All right. So if we do this, you're going to separate each tribe into boundaries. We're going to create large colonies. Where have we heard of that in American history before? Part of them in the northern plains, part of them in the southern plains, like Oklahoma, which is land that nobody at that point in time really wanted. It was considered to be very poor land. You couldn't do a lot of things there, even though later it's going to become very valuable. Now, this concept of confining is entirely foreign to Native Americans. They didn't think that anyone could own the land, so on and so forth. So we're trying to do something with them as a country that is very antithetical to the to the way that they have lived for thousands of years. That's just nice. It's going to be a hard process for everyone. All right, and so we're going to move along here. Now, what's the I call this the carrot and the stick process, whereas, the stick is the American army, especially during and after the American Civil War, where America has a very large army that is well-trained and used to fighting on a large scale over large areas of territory. So that's the stick. If you don't do this, we will send the army after you. Matter of fact, Philip Sheridan, one of the Union Army's best generals during the American Civil War, is going to be very adept at this. William Tecumseh Sherman, of Sherman's March fame, is going to be the commander, of the entire army at one point, who's prosecuting what we call the Indian Wars. But the carrot part is, hey, you know what? You go to the reservation, you don't lash out, you don't, try to fight us, and we're going to give you certain things. Okay, that's the carrot. But the sticky is, if not, we're going to send the army to deal with you. All right. But the problem with this whole process, you say, oh, hey, we're going to get something here. We're going to get this. We're going to be able to survive. We're going to be able to continue most of our way of life. But the problem is there is money to be made if you're one of these Indian agents, and you can abuse your authority, you can embezzle the money, you can give crappy provisions. It's a mess right here. So all of this is going on. This is a complete deconstruction of Native American civilization at that time. And it's pretty easy to see when you get a group that's coming along that's trying to do this to you. If you're the Native Americans, you're going to, a lot of them are going to resist to the last possible moment. And so that leads us into what we call the Indian Wars. And you see this, idyllic painting of Custer's last stand. But between the mid-1860s, 1862-ish, and 1890, there are going to be these nonstop wars. And that fighting occurs in various places throughout the West, north to south. It happens. And both sides are going to commit some wild atrocities, killing of women and children by the American army, like at the Sand Creek Massacre, or kidnapping women and children, scalping people by the Native Americans. Nobody is innocent here, and both sides have blood on their hands. Okay, again, talking about mutilating victims and whatnot, and killing. We see that part right there. But 1864, Sand Creek Massacre. I mean, this is right smack dab in the middle of the American Civil War, and you have 400 Indians killed under a flag of truce. You don't do that, okay? But it happened. Men, women, children, all killed, mutilated by the American army. Not a really great time for the image of the United States. And then something happens about 10 years later in the Black Hills of South Dakota, or the Dakotas, you end up with gold discovered. Now, that's going to create a mess right there, because this area, it's cold as can be in the winter. It's hot as blazes in the summer. I mean, it's flat. I mean, oh my God, it's quite inhospitable in terms of the extremes of the climate. But now they have been earmarked for Native Americans, because who wants that? But with gold there, yeah, I think you see what's getting ready to happen. And so George Custer, my goodness, of Civil War fame or infamy, just depending on how you want to look at it, he leads a group out there. And all of a sudden, when they're out there patrolling around, running around, supposedly protecting settlers are going to flock, because everybody wants to get rich quick. Okay? And so the Sioux, under Sitting Bull, are determined to fight. Okay, he, and amongst others, he's probably the most famous, but they're determined to fight this. There's no winning this. Okay, but sometimes when you push people against the wall, they come out swinging, and that's exactly what happens there at Little Bighorn in 1876. So Custer and the 7th Cavalry are supposed to do all this stuff, and end up happening is, boom, they end up, Custer and his entire entourage, his entire unit end up being killed. So this leads to an intensification of these Indian wars. And Chief Joseph in the Nez Perce there, Chief Joseph is one of the most interesting characters in the Indian wars, because Chief Joseph is, not only is he a great, warrior, he's also a pretty good politician, and he becomes the darling of a number of journalists at the time. And what happens is, again, look at this, just like up in the Black Hills, you get that gold discovered, boom, here comes all the settlers, right? So we got to move the Nez Perce off. So what happens is the American government, being at that time controlled by trust and other things like that, this gold is a huge deal, because the more gold that is in circulation in America, the more gold reserves that the country has, the greater you can expand the monetary supply. And that's not that way today, obviously, but it was back then. So they're going to reduce the territory by 90%. You've been promised X, and we're going to take Y out of it by 90%. So Chief Joseph determines to fight. And so since they can't fight them heads up, and they're actually fighting a general by the name of Oliver Otis Howard. And Oliver Otis Howard lost his arm during the American Civil War. His 11th Corps was the ones that broke and ran at Chancellorsville. He's one of the benefactors of Howard University to this day. I mean, Oliver Otis Howard is a decent man, has an incredible amount of sympathy for the Native Americans, but he has to chase them down. And so they're trying to get to the Canadian border, but they don't get there. Okay, it takes 3 months. They move around 1,700 miles, give or take a little bit. It is in newspapers everywhere. It is like a reality TV show in so many ways, except you're having to read about it in the papers. And they were told by Native American agents they're going to get sent back to Idaho. You're going to get to stay on part of your land, but after all that, no, send them to Oklahoma, where it's like almost, I think 40% is the number that is on here. 40% is the number I see. But, you're looking at nearly half of them are dying of diseases by being, kind of enclosed with people they don't know, in an area whose climate they don't understand, and around people whose diseases are much different from them and tend to overwhelm their natural immunity. Then in the Southwest, you've got the Apache, which I think growing up when I did in the 1970s and 80s, the last remnants of Westerns were still on TV, and they hit reruns, and they were on quite a bit. And Geronimo and the Apache were always like these uber successful, incredible warriors that were so hard to subdue. And on here, like I've said, they are the most difficult. And it takes about 5 years for them to get a hold of Geronimo. But by 1886, the Apache in the Southwest are finally suppressed. They're finally corralled. And what that leads to is almost an end to those Plains Wars. Now, you look at that gigantic buffalo right here on the screen. My goodness, to see one in person, they are incredibly huge. Um, but with the railroads, as they move through Indian territory, and these gigantic animals, in herds of hundreds, if not thousands, they're a threat. I mean, train hits one of those, bad stuff happens. Okay, so with the railroads bringing that basically unlimited numbers of settlers, much like we talked about last week, they bring them supplies, troops, farmers. I mean, they bring the stuff with them. Okay, these are like the interstate highways. So that we got to get rid of those buffalo in order to let the railroad come in. Then we've got disease, and we've already talked about that: smallpox, typhus, cholera. Things that most of us can't get anymore. They're decimating the native population. And we exterminate that buffalo. Well, there's the number. I knew the number was on here. 15 million. I can't imagine 15 million. They said that there would be herds of these so large that they could block out the sun. There were so many. That's impressive. I mean, that's absolutely impressive. And then there's demands for the hide and the meat. Like today, you can go to restaurants and get a bison burger, which are fantastic because they're so good for you. But a buffalo tongue was like a delicacy. I'm like, I'm going to pass on that. I do good to eat liver mush, okay? But all of a sudden, we're hunting the herds for the hides, for the meats, for the railroads. All of this leads to what, as you can imagine, the buffalo herds themselves shrinking almost to the point of almost extinction. Now, thank goodness they didn't, and there are still herds today. Matter of fact, there's a herd up in Rutherford County, but they're a managed herd. They're not a wild herd, obviously. Then you get the railroads hiring people to shoot them for sport, which really kind of makes me a little sad right there, but from passenger trains. And, again, 1885, notice the Apache were suppressed in 1886, Chief Joseph and them about the same time. I mean, you see this whole thing kind of coalesces, and it's going to be the end of the line for the great Native American civilizations of the day. Then you get this idea that's going to coincide with something we're going to talk about here in the next couple of weeks, is this: how do we civilize people? It's kind of odd to think about it that way, but that was the term of the day. And you get not only these reform efforts, of the populists and the progressives later, but you get these white efforts to what they call, quote, civilize the Indians or force them to assimilate into our society. Now, Helen Hunt Jackson, in her book, A Century of Dishonor, now look at that date, 1881. She creates a lot of sympathy for Native Americans and shows a lot of the country that these aren't backwards people. It is a different civilization, but is advanced in its own right, and as advanced as anything that white America can come up with. So, but this idea here is you get them to what, and you can't see it because it's behind my little image right there, to get them to try to walk the white man's road. Matter of fact, the greatest athlete that America's probably ever produced, Jim Thorpe, was a Native American. He was sent to what's called an Indian school, which you would take these young people off the reservation, send them to a school, much like if you've seen the limited series 1923 by Taylor Sheridan. That's part of his whole Yellowstone empire that he's got going. You see a very stylized version of that. But their idea was that you save the man, you kill the Indian and save the man, meaning you're going to get the Native American ideals out of him, or what I've got here, quote, walk the white man's road. Something that today we look at and we just shake our heads at it. But at that time, that was considered a modern and very progressive ideal. And there it is. The most famous being the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. There it is. They're going to kill the Indian, save the man. So what else we got going on here? Well, we got to do something with these tribes. And you notice this is right before 1890, which I've said is going to be a very, very important year. And with the Dawes Civilization Act, it's this idea that we're going to civilize the Indians, quote, for their own good. again, in 21st century, we're shaking our heads at this, but in the late 19th century, this was considered a very progressive or modern thing. And so the Dawes Severalities Act that Teddy Roosevelt's going to call the great pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass, is the idea is we're going to dissolve those tribes as legal entities, no more sue, no more nez perce, no more blah, 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 whatever. And it's going to wipe out any tribal ownership of land. Now, hold on, I would go back to those treaties like at Fort Laramie and Fort Atkinson. And the idea was you get these areas, your tribes get to have these areas. Well, that was the deal until we decided we didn't like that deal. And with the Dawes Act, at the end of this frontier period, we're going to wipe out tribal ownership. And now what happens is every family gets 160 acres of land. Personally, I would love to have 160 acres of land because that'd be quite a bit of wealth. Back then, on that land, on the plains, with the farming techniques and that they knew at the time, that's barely enough to survive. And so then, if you stay on that land, you do what you're supposed to, and you farm and you are act like good little white settlers, as I've got here in quotes, for 25 years, you get to be a full citizen. 25 years. Folks, I am 53 years old. That means half my life I would not have been a citizen. That is ridiculous, but that is what they came up with. And then if you want to look around and see how much land that is, that leaves a whole bunch of that land that's unsold, that is unclaimed, and now the government says they can sell it, and they can use that money to fund efforts to, quote, civilize these tribes again. This right here is a bad deal if you're Native Americans. It's an absolutely horrible deal. All right? But by 1900, turn of the 20th century, around 50% of the land had been lost. 156 million acres had been allotted to other groups. This is an absolute travesty for Native Americans at that time. Excuse me there. So, who's going to fill this void? Farmers, right? So we're calling this the farming frontier. And if you go back 1862, square in the middle of the American Civil War, the federal government is still trying to get people to move west. And so the Homestead Act at that point in time gives settlers, again, 160 acres of land for either free, I like free, if they consistently improve that land for 5 years. Now, the Native Americans, much later, we're going to say, you got to be good people for 25 years. This is for 5 years, and you got to pay about $30, which in the grand scheme is a nominal fee, okay? Then there's the Homestead Act that provides some difficulties. People go out there, they show up, free land, 160 acres, wow. But they go out there and figure out, whoa, there's a reason this land wasn't settled. There's a reason we gave it to Native Americans. And so what happens is about 2/3 of them, or at least that's what we think, they said they didn't stay on the land, or they lied about being on the land. Okay, because again, I've told you that 160 acres is inadequate, and then there's drought, and then there's insects. And when we get to the Great Depression, we're going to see something called the Dust Bowl, which is part of this very region we're talking about. Then there's fraud, okay, and land speculators are going to get a hold of it, and they're going to sell it back and forth and back and forth. You know, these farmers thought they were getting, anyway, you see what's going on here. There's people making money off of it, but they're not the people that the law was designed to help. Okay, and then there's dummy homesteaders. Now, what you see behind me is not a dummy homestead, but they would build fake homes. They would build little bitty cabins. They would build all these things that make it look like it was settled, but in reality, it wasn't. That way, they got the free and clear title to the land. It could sell it at some point in the future. So what happens is I've got this the vanishing frontier, because the frontier eventually does close, and it closes in 1890. The U.S. Census declared that there was no longer a discernible line to demark the frontier from civilization. So 1890 is when that happens. Frederick Jackson Turner, the great historian from the University of Wisconsin, is going to tell us about how the frontier was the very essence of America. Because you could always go west, you could always pick up stakes, you could always pull yourself up by the bootstraps, so to speak. But by 1890, the U.S. Census says there is no more discernible frontier in this country. All right. So why is the idea of the frontier significant? Because it is that symbol of opportunity. You could always pack up and go west. Today, that's not there anymore. I mean, we can't do that. But in 1890, there was no more west to go to per se. You still could, okay? Theodore Roosevelt's going to even do it during part of that time after his daughter and his wife pass away, basically on the same day. All of that is going to happen, and he's going to go out to Montana, which is still wild and woolly even at that point in time. But there was no real discernible frontier, so to speak. So that opportunity is going to have to be found elsewhere. And as a nation, we're going to find it elsewhere in our ideas of imperialism later. But that's a story for a different week. All right. So this end of American mobility, it's not really the end, but again, in terms of the mindset, there's nowhere left to go. There's nowhere that is uncharted, so to speak. Okay. And that frontier had always been our safety valve as populations in the East increased and increased instead of exploding like you see in Europe, and they explode into revolution and other violent and you know, upheavals and stuff like that. That safety valve isn't there anymore. And we're going to start to see that by the 1890s. By about 3 years later, we're going to see a great panic and really and truly a depression that's going to happen as a result of this. There is no more safety valve for excess population. And you can see right there a couple of things I have put. You can stop the video and look at that, or you can download the PowerPoint, which, you know, is on your stuff for this week. All right. So what happens is, you know, Frederick Jackson Turner makes this argument that American history has been, in a large degree, the history of colonization of the Great West. I can buy that to a greater or lesser degree, and it's part of your discussion board for this time around. So I'm going to let you dig into that more here and in the American Yawp and into the documents that we have for the week. Now, there's going to be some agrarian unrest here. This man, oh, we're going to get to him when we get to populism. This is William Jennings Bryan. And if you're a farmer in the West, I mean, hey, you just booted the Native Americans out of the way. Yay, you, right? But what happens is now you have to live and survive on this frontier. And one crop economies, I mean, the South saw it before the Civil War, and that's part of the reason that the American Civil War took place, is this reliance on King Cotton. And if King Cotton's prices drop, then you got problems. Same thing if it's wheat or if it's corn or whatever it is in the West. When those prices drop, you've got problems. And sometimes Mother Nature simply does not cooperate, okay? So you end up with some deflation, which means the money supply actually shrinks. When my parents built their house in 1977, I remember their house payment was like $250 a month. And I mean, my mother going, oh my gosh, I don't know if we can afford that. I wish my house payment was $250. Heck, I wish my car payment was $250. Some months when it gets cold, the gas bill is that high around here. But when you take out a mortgage and like a 30-year loan, you're assuming that by the end of that mortgage, it's much easier to repay those monthly payments than it is when you take it out. And so these mortgages are based on this idea of inflationary, but when you get a deflationary where money becomes worth more, which none of us in this course have seen in our lifetime, then mortgages are harder to repay and foreclosures happen. And we'll get to how those foreclosures work when we get to the Great Depression, because they can't happen to us that way today, thank goodness. So that happens. So farmers get caught in that debt cycle, and all of a sudden the bank or bigger corporations start to own these farms, and you end up being nothing more than a glorified sharecropper. And a quarter of all farms by 1880, and this number includes in the South and the West, so it's a little skewed, but a quarter are operated by tenants, including my great-great-grandparents on at least one side of the family. Then you mix in some environmental disasters, grasshoppers. I mean, grasshoppers are just nasty. I remember growing up, I hated the full things. My grandfather used to say they spit tobacco juice on you. I'm like, thanks a lot, Grandpa. But they will eat your crops up. The boll weevil will eat cotton up. And so you kind of hope you don't go down to Lowe's or Home Depot and get you something to spray, or get online and get you some Tall Star to spray around. Back then, there was nothing you could do except wait it out. And if it happened, then it could devastate your crop and your livelihood. So you get in 1887, there's a long series of droughts. I mean, today anytime there is a dry spell, you would think it's the end of the world the way our news media covers it. Okay, well, we're not even going to get into that. But we were having those in the late 1800s as well out west, and there was no way to. Irrigation was such a new concept and was so not many farms had it that those droughts put you in danger of losing everything. And then government policies hurt it because of these railroads. When we go back to last week, we talked about how the railroads could really and truly devastate farmers. They could, because they could charge whatever rates they want. They found ways to keep prices artificially low. And so what you have are farmers are at the mercy of corporations and trusts and agents. And it's bad. These farmers who just kicked out Native Americans are now at the mercy of the very people who helped them kick Native Americans out. And that is a vicious cycle they find themselves in. You know, machinery, fertilizer, barbed wire, all are controlled by people who can artificially inflate those prices and keep you in debt. Okay, so we'll move along here for just a second. You talk about the railroads and all that. So what happens is, the end of this thing, we're talking about the emergence of a farmers movement, okay? The Grange, or the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry. I mean, we can call it the Grange, okay? And their objective is to help farm life. And if you've ever watched that TV series, Little House on the Prairie, which was very popular when I was growing up, the Paul on there is always talking about the Grange. Well, this is what he's talking about. And their objective here is to stimulate farm life. I mean, it talks about social and educational and fraternal activities, but their real thing is to attempt to form cooperatives and somehow or another do battle with big business and the railroads in order to help farmers be able to make a living. And just that's the simplest way to put it. Talking about buying and selling in bulk and negotiate it collectively with the railroads and all of that would help them to make a living. So in politics, they get some of the, especially these Midwestern states, they encourage them to enact legislation. I mean, that, you saw that with Illinois and the first railroad laws. That's part of the Grange. It's part of what we're going to call populism, which is going to be one of our upcoming lectures, okay? And those are, against these big trust and corporations. Well, of course the trusts are going to fight it. Of course the corporations are going to fight it, and they do. But what the Grange forms itself into is it begins to grow and mature and coalesce. It becomes the Populist Party. And they emerge in the late 1880s, early in the 1892 elections when they first come onto the national stage, so to speak. But they begin to represent the interest of farmers and more rural people. And you think about the South and you think about the West, that's where you have those massive numbers of farmers who make up the bulk of your population. And so finally, well, we're not going to worry about Mary Elizabeth Lease. It's okay. We're not going to worry about her at all. But she did say raise less corn and more hay, which is, it's kind of funny, but it's this idea of we control the food supply and some of these natural resources in this country. And so we've got to learn how to use that as a weapon. Farmers are never really going to do that. Though in France today, apparently, and in Belgium, well, they're having fun. They're picketing and protesting and doing a whole lot of stuff over there, protesting the way they're treated. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out.